Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Arizona. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing the places and times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1898. Arizona Territory was still 7 years away from achieving statehood, existing in that peculiar liminal space between frontier wildness and civic organization. Copper mines and cattle ranches dominated the economy, and the small settlement of Wickenburg, roughly 60 miles northwest of Phoenix, was experiencing the quiet aftermath of its modest gold rush. The town had been named after Henry Wickenburg, a German immigrant who discovered the famous Vulture mine in 1863. Which had yielded over $2 million in gold before declining production in the 1880s. Most travelers passing through would comment on the harsh beauty of the desert landscape, the saguaro cacti standing like silent sentinels, the distant purple mountains that seemed to hover between earth and sky, and the merciless sun that beat down upon everything without discrimination or mercy. The Hassayampa River, which ran near the town, was the subject of local legend. Anyone who drank from its waters would never again tell the complete truth. Perhaps this folklore was oddly prescient, given the events that would later unfold, and the half-truths and omissions that would come to surround them. What few travelers mentioned in their journals or correspondences was a small wooden structure that sat approximately 4 miles east of town, just off what would later become Highway 60, near a small seasonal wash that locals called Bitter Creek. The structure was simple, a one-room shack with a small lean-to addition, surrounded by a crude fence made of ocotillo branches and barbed wire. It sat alone on a patch of dusty soil with no other habitations visible for miles around. The nearest neighbor, the Henderson cattle spread, was over 3 miles away across difficult terrain. Most passers-by assumed it was an abandoned prospector's claim, perhaps a failed attempt at ranching. Few knew it was occupied. Fewer still knew by whom. And almost no one knew what had happened there, what dark discovery had been made beneath the Arizona soil, and what consequences had unfolded from that discovery. County records from that time period remain surprisingly incomplete. A fire at the Maricopa County Records Office in 1912 destroyed many documents from the territorial period, a convenient erasure that some researchers have suggested was not entirely accidental. What remains are fragments, census notations, tax records, and scattered reports from U.S. Marshals who patrolled the region. Among these fragments, references to the property appear only as the Crowther claim, registered in 1891 to one Samuel Crowther, formerly of Pennsylvania. The deed of ownership, one of the few surviving documents related to the property, describes the parcel as 40 acres of unimproved land situated east of the settlement of Wickenburg, bordered by Bitter Creek to the south. The purchase price was listed as $300, a modest sum even then, suggesting the land was not considered particularly valuable for mining or agricultural purposes. The document bears Samuel Crowther's signature, a spidery scrawl that a handwriting analyst would later describe as indicating a man of nervous disposition and meticulous nature. Samuel Crowther does not appear to have been a notable figure in the community. His name appears on a handful of mining claim registrations, none of which seem to have produced significant wealth. A ledger from the Wickenburg Assay Office shows he submitted samples for testing on 7 occasions between 1891 and 1894, with results indicating minimal gold or silver content. After 1894, his name vanishes from the assay records, suggesting he had abandoned his prospecting activities. A single photograph recovered from the Wickenburg Historical Society shows a group of men outside the Miners' Exchange Saloon in 1893. A notation on the back identifies the third man from the left as S. Crowther, showing a gaunt man with a full beard and wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. His posture is stiff, his expression unreadable behind the beard. But there is something in his stance, a slight leaning away from his companions, that suggests discomfort with social situations. This physical reservation would later be echoed in accounts of his wife. Interviews conducted in the 1950s with elderly residents of Wickenburg yielded few additional insights. Most recalled Samuel Crowther as "that quiet fella who kept to himself," a description so common among frontier populations as to be practically meaningless. One respondent, Elijah Carpenter, who had worked as a young man at the general store in the 1890s, remembered Crowther as educated-sounding but odd. He'd come in for supplies and start talking about the properties of wood like he was giving a lecture, then stop mid-sentence and hurry out. Never did finish a conversation proper. What we know with certainty is that Samuel Crowther died in the winter of 1895, according to a brief mention in the Deaths and Notices section of the Arizona Republic. The cause listed was consumption, the common term for tuberculosis at the time. The notice mentioned he was survived by his wife, Edith Crowther. No obituary was published. No funeral announcement was made. It was as if Samuel Crowther had simply faded from existence, leaving behind only the most perfunctory acknowledgment of his passing. Interestingly, there is no record of Samuel Crowther's burial in the Wickenburg Cemetery. A review of burial records conducted in 1928 by the Daughters of Arizona Pioneers found no mention of his interment. When this discrepancy was noted and investigated, town officials suggested that he might have been buried on his own property, a common practice in isolated areas where transport of a body to town might be difficult, particularly in winter conditions. No documentation of a home burial permit exists, however, raising the first of many questions surrounding the Crowther case. It was after Samuel's death that the story of the Crowther Shack begins to take a darker turn. Edith Crowther did not return east to family as many widows did. She did not remarry or move into town. Instead, according to local accounts recorded years later, she remained at the isolated shack, living alone at the edge of the desert. This behavior, while unusual, was not unprecedented in the frontier West, where widows sometimes maintained homesteads independently rather than abandoning claims that represented their only material assets. Accounts of Edith Crowther's appearance and demeanor come primarily from merchants in Wickenburg, with whom she occasionally traded. Jacob Mercer, who operated a general store until 1918, left a ledger that contained multiple entries for Mrs. Crowther. The frequency of these transactions provides a timeline of sorts. In 1896, she visited town approximately once every 2 weeks. By early 1897, her visits had decreased to once monthly. By late 1897, the gaps between visits stretched to 6 or 7 weeks. In his personal notes, later donated to the Territorial Historical Society, Mercer described her as tall and rigid, like a piece of sun-bleached wood given human form. He noted that she spoke rarely and then only in precise, measured sentences, never engaging in the casual pleasantries that characterized frontier commerce. "She looks through you rather than at you," he wrote in one entry, "as if her mind is occupied with calculations no one else could comprehend." Most significant in Mercer's notes was his observation that Mrs. Crowther's purchases followed a strange pattern. "She buys salt in quantities that would serve a family of 8, he wrote in 1896, kerosene enough to light a home 10 times the size of her shack, and rope, always more rope, though what use she has for it I cannot imagine." Later entries indicated that in addition to these items, she began purchasing carpentry tools, saws, planes, chisels, despite having no apparent need for woodworking implements. Mercer was not the only one to note Edith Crowther's peculiarities. Dr. Thomas Hendricks, who served as the region's only physician for nearly 20 years, recorded in his medical journal that Mrs. Crowther had consulted him only once in early 1897. She complained of trouble sleeping, citing persistent noises that kept her awake. When he suggested the noises might be coyotes or other desert wildlife, she reportedly smiled in a way that made him distinctly uncomfortable, and said, "No, doctor. The noises come from inside." Upon further questioning, she explained that the sounds resembled wood creaking, like an old house settling, except that her shack was too small and too simply constructed to make such noises. When Dr. Hendricks suggested the sounds might be manifestations of grief, auditory hallucinations brought on by the trauma of her husband's death and her subsequent isolation, she reportedly laughed, a sound that the doctor described as like dry twigs snapping. If only they were hallucinations, she told him, according to his notes. Hallucinations don't grow longer. Dr. Hendricks prescribed a tincture of laudanum, the standard treatment for sleeplessness at the time. In his notes, he indicated his belief that the widow was suffering from melancholia brought on by isolation and grief. He recommended she consider relocating to town where she might benefit from human companionship. According to his records, she never returned for a refill of her prescription nor sought his services again. A particularly noteworthy entry in Dr. Hendricks's journal, dated September 1897, mentions a chance encounter with Mrs. Crowther on the road to Phoenix. He was returning from treating a patient at an outlying ranch when he passed her traveling in the opposite direction. What caught his attention was not merely her presence on the isolated road, but her appearance. "I would have sworn she stood at least 6 inches taller than when I treated her months ago," he wrote. When I commented on this, suggesting that perhaps the desert air agreed with her constitution, she gave me such a look of mingled terror and warning that I fell silent and hurried on my way. Through 1897, Edith Crowther's trips to town grew less frequent. By early 1898, merchants noted they had not seen her in several months. Under normal circumstances, such absence might have prompted concern. But the people of Wickenburg had largely come to regard the Crowther widow as an eccentric figure best left to her own devices. The isolation of frontier life bred a certain respect for privacy that sometimes bordered on willful ignorance. It was not until April of 1898 that anyone had cause to visit the Crowther shack. A cattle rancher named William Denton was tracking several strays that had wandered from his herd. His pursuit led him to the vicinity of Bitter Creek, and as he later testified in a sworn statement to U.S. Marshal James Thompson, curiosity led him to approach the Crowther property when he noticed there was no smoke rising from the chimney, despite the cool spring morning. Denton was a man of practical experience, having worked cattle throughout the Southwest for more than 20 years. His statement, preserved only because a copy was sent to the territorial governor's office, is notable for its straightforward, almost clinical description of what most would consider deeply disturbing discoveries. The lack of embellishment lends his account a credibility that more sensational narratives might lack. According to his statement, Denton approached the shack and called out several times. Receiving no response, he pushed open the door, which was not locked but merely secured with a simple wooden latch. The interior of the shack was dark, the windows covered with what appeared to be burlap sacking. As Denton's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he became aware of a peculiar arrangement of furniture. The single room contained a small cast-iron stove, a table, a rocking chair, and a narrow bed, all standard furnishings for a frontier dwelling. What was not standard, however, was that every piece of furniture, including the stove, had been bound with rope. Thick coils wrapped around the legs of the table and chair. The bed frame was similarly bound, with ropes extending up to the ceiling beams, creating a web-like pattern overhead. Denton described a powerful, unpleasant odor in the shack. Not the smell of death or decay, as he first feared, but something he described as chemical and wrong, like kerosene mixed with something bitter. The floor was stained with dark patches that appeared to be from spilled kerosene. Several large sacks of salt were stacked in one corner, some empty, others still sealed. Most disturbing of all was what Denton found scratched into the wooden walls. Every available surface had been covered with a single phrase, repeated hundreds of times in varying sizes. "They stretch at night." The writing appeared to have been done with different implements. Some lines were clearly made with a knife or other sharp tool, others with charcoal, still others with what might have been blood or dark paint. The effect, as Denton described it, was of a mind gradually losing its bearings, becoming more desperate with each repetition. Of Edith Crowther herself there was no immediate sign. Her personal belongings, clothing, a hairbrush, a Bible, were still present, suggesting she had not packed and left voluntarily. A half-finished meal sat on the table, the food desiccated but not rotted, suggesting it had been abandoned several weeks earlier. A journal lay open beside the plate, but its pages contained only more repetitions of the same phrase that covered the walls. It was only after Denton made a more thorough examination of the property that he made his most disturbing discovery. Behind the shack, at a distance of approximately 30 yards, he found freshly disturbed earth. Unlike the surrounding hard-packed desert soil, this area had been dug up and refilled multiple times, creating a patchwork of mounds and depressions. Thinking he might have located a grave, he returned to town to report his findings to the local authorities. Marshal Thompson, accompanied by Dr. Hendricks, returned with Denton to the Crowther shack the following morning. The group was joined by 2 deputies and a local man named Frederick Hollis, who had some experience with photography. Hollis had been engaged to document the scene, an unusual precaution that suggests Thompson already anticipated the extraordinary nature of what they might find. The investigation that followed was documented in Thompson's official report, a document that would later be ordered sealed by the territorial governor's office. What we know of its contents comes from fragments that survived and from the personal journal of Dr. Hendricks, who was deeply troubled by what he witnessed and felt compelled to create his own record of events. Upon excavating the disturbed earth behind the shack, they did not find a body as expected. Instead, they discovered a collection of wooden boxes, each approximately 2 feet long and 1 foot wide. The boxes had been buried at varying depths, some just below the surface, others as deep as 4 feet. In total, they recovered 11 boxes. Each box had been sealed with a combination of pine tar and wax. Each bore a date carved into its lid, spanning from December 1895 to March 1898. The most recent box, according to Dr. Hendricks's notes, had been buried only weeks before Denton's discovery of the property. What the boxes contained defied immediate explanation. Dr. Hendricks described the contents in clinical terms as organic material preserved in salt and kerosene, material that, upon closer examination, appeared to be pieces of furniture. Not furniture as we would normally understand it, but rather pieces of wood that had been shaped, sanded, and finished to resemble furniture components, chair legs, table edges, bedposts. Some pieces were recognizable as parts of specific furniture types. Others had been distorted to such a degree that their original purpose was unclear. What made these items disturbing was not their form, but their behavior. As Dr. Hendricks noted in his journal, when removed from their preservative bath and exposed to air, the wood pieces exhibited properties that defied explanation. They appeared to flex and elongate slightly, as if stretching. This phenomenon was subtle enough that Marshal Thompson initially accused the doctor of imagining things. But when multiple pieces were laid side by side on a blanket in the sunlight, the movement became undeniable. The wood seemed to be expanding, not in the way that wood normally swells with moisture, but in a directional, almost deliberate manner. Dr. Hendricks estimated the pieces increased in length by approximately 1/8 of an inch over the course of an hour before ceasing their movement. Frederick Hollis attempted to capture this phenomenon through time-lapse photography, setting up his camera to take exposures at regular intervals. The resulting images, which were included in Thompson's report and later confiscated, reportedly showed clear evidence of the wood's unusual properties. Unfortunately, no copies of these photographs are known to exist today. Analysis of the wood was limited by the scientific capabilities of the time. Dr. Hendricks took samples and examined them under his personal microscope, noting only that the cellular structure appeared abnormally active for dead wood, and that the grain patterns were unlike any timber he was familiar with. He speculated in his notes that the wood might be from a foreign species, perhaps imported by Samuel Crowther during his life. A particularly unsettling aspect of Dr. Hendricks's examination was his observation that when cut, the wood exuded a clear viscous fluid that he initially mistook for sap. Upon closer inspection, however, he noted that unlike normal sap, this fluid did not dry or harden when exposed to air. Instead, it remained liquid and exhibited a faint phosphorescence in darkness. When a drop of this fluid accidentally came into contact with his skin, Dr. Hendricks reported a sensation of crawling, as if the fluid were attempting to work its way into the flesh. He immediately washed the area with alcohol and experienced no further effects, but the incident left him deeply disturbed. Marshall Thompson's primary concern, however, was not the strange properties of the wood, but the whereabouts of Edith Crowther. A search of the surrounding area yielded no body, no blood evidence, and no signs of foul play. Her personal items remained in the shack, including a small leather purse containing $27 in coins and bills, a not insignificant sum at the time, suggesting robbery had not been a motive in her disappearance. The search extended to a radius of approximately 1 mile from the shack, but found no trace of Edith Crowther. The only potential evidence, as noted by one of the deputies, was a set of unusual tracks leading away from the property toward the southeast. These tracks resembled human footprints, but with two peculiarities. They were spaced unusually far apart, suggesting a stride much longer than average, and they left unusually deep impressions, indicating either significant weight or the application of abnormal downward force. The tracks extended for approximately 100 yards before disappearing on rocky ground. The investigation might have ended there, with Edith Crowther declared missing and her case eventually forgotten among the many unsolved disappearances of the territorial period. But 3 days after the initial discovery, as Thompson was preparing to conclude his investigation, a mail carrier named Josiah Beck came forward with information that cast the case in an entirely new light. Beck, who delivered mail along a route that included isolated homesteads around Wickenburg, reported that he had seen Edith Crowther just 1 week earlier, not at her shack, but approximately 15 miles south, walking along a trail toward Phoenix. According to his statement, preserved in Thompson's notes, she was carrying a large carpet bag and moving with purpose. When he offered her a ride, she declined, stating only that she was going to find a bigger house. What made Beck's account particularly noteworthy was his description of Mrs. Crowther's appearance. He described her as unusually tall, taller than he remembered her being on previous encounters. When pressed for details, he estimated that she stood well over 6 feet, though he had previously thought her to be of average height. He also noted that her movement seemed stiff and uncomfortable, as if she were walking on stilts, hidden beneath her skirt. Perhaps most unsettling was Beck's description of her voice. He characterized it as having a wooden quality, lacking the natural cadence of human speech. When she told him she needed a bigger house, her words were punctuated by what he described as cracking sounds, like branches breaking under stress. Beck admitted that the encounter had left him unsettled, but he had attributed his discomfort to the isolated location and Mrs. Crowther's well-known eccentricity. Marshall Thompson, likely skeptical of Beck's observations, nonetheless extended his search to include the trail to Phoenix. No further sightings of Edith Crowther were reported. No woman matching her description arrived in Phoenix according to inquiries sent to the authorities there. Like her husband before her, Edith Crowther had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the disturbing contents of her property. Thompson's report, submitted to the Territorial Governor's Office in late April 1898, included a detailed inventory of items found at the shack, descriptions of the wooden boxes and their contents, transcripts of all witness statements, and a formal request for scientific experts to examine the wood samples. The report concluded with Thompson's assessment that, while no evidence of criminal activity has been found, the circumstances surrounding the Crowther disappearance and the unusual properties of materials recovered from the property warrant further investigation by those with appropriate scientific expertise. The case might have gained more attention had it not been overshadowed by national events. The Spanish-American War began in April 1898, dominating newspapers and public discourse. Local concerns, particularly those as strange and inexplicable as the Crowther case, were easily overlooked. By the time interest might have returned to the matter, official channels had already begun the process of burying the story. In June 1898, 2 months after the discovery at the Crowther shack, Marshal Thompson received a directive from the Territorial Governor's Office ordering all evidence from the case to be transported to Phoenix for specialized examination. The wooden boxes and their contents were collected and supposedly sent to the capital. No record of their arrival exists in the Territorial Archives. Thompson's official report was ordered sealed, and he was instructed to make no further public statements regarding the case. The directive, a copy of which survived among Thompson's personal papers, cited concerns of public order and scientific integrity as justification for the unusual level of secrecy. It further stated that the matter had been referred to federal authorities with jurisdiction over matters of national scientific interest, though no specific department or agency was named. Dr. Hendricks, who had retained samples of the wood for his own examination, reported in his journal that in July 1898, 2 men identifying themselves as representatives of the Department of the Interior visited his office in Wickenburg. They confiscated his samples and notes, citing concerns about public health and hysteria. They left no receipt, no documentation of their visit, and no contact information. Dr. Hendricks described the men as unusually formal in both dress and manner, with the bearing of military officers despite their civilian attire. One detail he found particularly noteworthy was that both men wore gloves despite the summer heat, removing them only briefly when handling the wood samples. During this brief removal, Hendricks observed what appeared to be bandages on their fingers, though neither man offered any explanation for these injuries. Frederick Hollis, the photographer who had documented the scene, reported a similar visit. His photographic plates were confiscated, and he was warned against discussing the matter further. Hollis later claimed that the men had offered him a substantial sum of money in exchange for his silence, though this claim cannot be verified. What is known is that Hollis, previously a prolific chronicler of local events and landscapes, produced remarkably few photographs in the years following the Crowther incident. The Crowther property itself was subject to equally mysterious proceedings. County records show that in August 1898, the land was purchased by a corporate entity identified only as Western Resource Development Lilsti. The sale price was listed as $1, suggesting a nominal transaction designed to establish legal ownership quickly. No further information about Western Resource Development Lilsti appears in any accessible records. What is known is that within weeks of the purchase, the Crowther shack was demolished, the well filled in, and the entire property fenced with warnings against trespassing. Local residents reported unusual activity at the property during this period. Multiple wagons arrived carrying men and equipment. A temporary structure, described as resembling a military tent, was erected near where the shack had stood. For approximately 2 weeks, work of some kind was conducted, primarily at night. Lanterns could be seen moving about the property, and the sound of digging was frequently heard. When the men finally departed, they left nothing behind but the fence and warning signs. By 1899, less than a year after William Denton's disturbing discovery, it was as if the Crowther shack had never existed. The land remained fenced and unused. Local residents, when questioned years later by historians researching the area, either professed no knowledge of the Crowthers or dismissed the matter as unpleasant business best forgotten. This deliberate erasure might have been complete were it not for three separate sources that emerged years later, each providing a piece of what remains an incomplete puzzle. The first source was Jacob Mercer, the Wickenburg merchant who had supplied Edith Crowther with salt, kerosene, and rope. In 1911, suffering from heart disease and perhaps feeling the need to unburden himself before death, Mercer wrote a letter to his sister in Chicago. That letter, preserved by his family and donated to the Arizona Historical Society in 1975, well outside our narrative's timeline, contained a confession of sorts. According to Mercer's letter, Samuel Crowther had confided in him shortly before his death. Crowther claimed that he had discovered something unusual while digging a well on his property in 1894. At a depth of approximately 20 feet, he had struck what he initially thought was a petrified log. Upon extracting pieces of this material, however, he realized it was not stone, but an unusually dense, darkly colored wood unlike any he had seen before. Mercer's letter described Crowther's excitement about the discovery. Samuel believed he had found an unknown species of tree, perhaps one that grew underground in a manner similar to certain fungi, Mercer wrote. He spoke of scientific recognition and financial rewards that might come from such a discovery. In retrospect, his enthusiasm seems tragically misplaced. Crowther told Mercer that he had fashioned a simple stool from this wood, thinking its unusual appearance would make it a conversation piece. Within weeks of bringing the stool into his home, however, he noticed that it seemed to be growing taller. At first, he dismissed this as imagination or a trick of memory, but after measuring and marking the stool's height, he confirmed that it was indeed growing, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably. Fascinated rather than alarmed, Crowther extracted more of the strange wood and began crafting additional furniture, a small table, shelves, eventually a bed frame. Each piece exhibited the same property of gradual elongation. Rather than fear this phenomenon, Crowther seemed to view it as a potential source of profit. In his discussions with Mercer, he spoke of establishing a furniture business that would produce self-expanding pieces, perfect for growing families. According to Mercer's account, Crowther had already begun making plans to extract larger quantities of the wood when his health began to deteriorate. His consumption appeared suddenly and progressed with unusual speed. Within months, he was bedridden. Mercer noted that when he visited the Crowther shack during Samuel's illness, he was struck by how the furniture seemed to loom over the sick man's bed, like silent sentinels waiting for him to expire. What Crowther failed to consider, according to Mercer's account, was that the growth had limits. After extending to roughly twice their original dimensions, the wooden pieces would begin to show signs of stress, creaking sounds, splitting along the grain, and a strange dampness that seeped from the cracks. Eventually they would collapse, not breaking cleanly as normal wood might, but crumbling into fibrous strands that resembled plant roots more than timber. By the time Samuel Crowther realized the full cycle of the wood's properties, he had already filled his small home with furniture crafted from the material. He had also, perhaps coincidentally, begun developing the cough that would eventually be diagnosed as tuberculosis. In his final conversations with Mercer, Crowther expressed concern not for himself, but for his wife, who would be left alone with what he had come to call the stretching wood. Mercer's letter included a disturbing observation from his last visit to Samuel Crowther. As I sat beside his bed, I could not help but notice that the wooden frame had begun to twist around his body, as if attempting to envelop him. When I mentioned this, Samuel laughed between coughs and said, "It likes the warmth of living things." I suggested moving him to a normal bed, but he refused, saying it was too late for such precautions. Perhaps most significant in Mercer's letter was his recounting of Samuel Crowther's final warning. On his deathbed, Samuel allegedly told Mercer, If anything happens to Edith, burn this place to the ground. Don't let anyone else touch the wood. It changes things, Jacob. It changed me." When Mercer asked what he meant, Crowther reportedly held up his hands, showing fingernails that had taken on a striated wooden appearance. "It gets inside you," he whispered, "and then it grows." Mercer's letter indicated that he had offered to help Edith dispose of the furniture after Samuel's death, but she had refused, insisting that her husband's creations were all she had left of him. Mercer admitted that he had not pressed the issue, nor had he shared what he knew with authorities after her disappearance. "Some matters," he wrote to his sister, "are beyond the understanding of rational men, and perhaps best left unexplained." The letter concluded with a disturbing postscript. Mercer confessed that he had not been entirely honest about his own involvement with the strange wood. Samuel had given him a small carved box as a gift in 1894. Mercer had kept it on his mantelpiece as a curiosity, noting with interest how it gradually expanded over the years. "I keep it bound with wire now," he wrote, "and soak it in kerosene once a month, which seems to slow its growth. Sometimes in the night I hear it creaking, as if testing its constraints, and sometimes, sister, I swear I hear it whispering." The second source emerged in 1914 when a Phoenix physician named Dr. Alan Whitaker published an article in a medical journal regarding an unusual patient he had treated in 1898. The patient, whom he identified only as Mrs. C., had sought treatment for severe back pain and joint stiffness. Upon examination, Dr. Whitaker discovered an alarming condition. The woman's spine had elongated, with new vertebrae apparently developing between existing ones. This medical impossibility was accompanied by similar elongation in the woman's femurs, tibias, and arm bones. Over the course of several examinations spanning 3 months, Dr. Whitaker documented growth of nearly 4 inches in the woman's overall height. The condition was accompanied by intense pain, particularly at night, which the patient described as feeling like being pulled on a medieval rack. Laboratory analysis of bone fragments, obtained through what Whitaker delicately referred to as surgical necessity, revealed abnormal cellular structures that the doctor compared to plant matter more than human bone. Under the microscope, the cells displayed properties more consistent with plant tissue, including rigid cell walls, and what appeared to be rudimentary vascular structures similar to those found in woody plants. Most disturbing were the changes to the patient's skin and hair. Dr. Whitaker documented a gradual transformation of the epidermis, which began to develop a texture he described as reminiscent of bark, with vertical striations and a roughened surface. The patient's hair, originally described as brown, gradually stiffened and took on a more branch-like quality, while darkening to nearly black. These changes began at the scalp and progressed downward, affecting the face, neck, and upper torso by the time of the patient's final visit. Dr. Whitaker's attempts to treat the condition proved futile. Conventional pain medications provided minimal relief. Surgical intervention to remove affected tissue resulted only in accelerated growth in adjacent areas. His final treatment approach involved immersion in a saline bath, which the patient reported provided temporary relief from pain, but did not halt the progression of the condition. The patient's psychological state deteriorated in parallel with the physical changes. Initially lucid and cooperative, she gradually became withdrawn and secretive. During her final visits, she spoke little, but was observed murmuring to herself when she thought the doctor wasn't listening. Dr. Whitaker recorded fragments of these utterances: growing inside, need more room, and most frequently, they stretch at night. After 3 months of treatment, the patient failed to return for her scheduled appointment. Dr. Whitaker sent inquiries to her listed address, but received no response. A visit to the boarding house where she had been staying revealed that she had departed in the middle of the night, leaving behind most of her possessions. The landlady reported that strange creaking sounds had been coming from the patient's room in the days before her disappearance, sounds that didn't stop with the sunrise like they should. Dr. Whitaker's attempts to publish his findings at the time were rejected by medical journals as fantastical. It was only years later, when Whitaker was near retirement and less concerned with professional reputation, that the account found its way into print in the obscure Journal of Anomalous Medical Phenomena. Even then, it was largely dismissed by the medical community as either fabrication or misdiagnosis. While Dr. Whitaker never identified his patient by name, the timing of the case and his description of her as a widow from a rural settlement have led some researchers to speculate that Mrs. C may have been Edith Crowther. If this identification is correct, it suggests that prolonged exposure to the strange wood had somehow transferred its properties to human tissue, a horrifying proposition that might explain Edith's desperate attempts to bind the furniture in her home, as documented in William Denton's initial discovery. The third and perhaps most disturbing source appeared in 1920 in the form of an anonymous letter sent to the Arizona Republic newspaper. The letter was never published, having been intercepted by individuals claiming to represent federal authorities. However, a copy was retained by an editor at the paper, Franklin Doyle, and surfaced years later among his personal effects after his death in 1942. The letter purported to be from a former employee of the Department of the Interior who had been involved in what he called the containment of the Arizona wood. According to this account, the material found on the Crowther property was not unique. Similar discoveries had been made at 3 other locations across the American Southwest between 1890 and 1910. The first was reportedly in a remote area of New Mexico near the town of Taos in 1890. The second occurred in southeastern Utah in 1904. The third, discovered in 1909, was located in Nevada, approximately 80 miles east of Reno. Each site had been quickly secured by federal authorities operating under the cover of various government departments. Each had yielded samples of wood with identical properties, gradual elongation followed by structural failure and transformation into root-like fibers. And in each case, prolonged contact with the wood had produced physiological changes in nearby organisms, from household pets to human occupants. I have witnessed a cat transformed by proximity to the specimens, the anonymous writer claimed. Over the course of 6 weeks, its limbs elongated to twice their normal length. Its spine became rigid, its fur developed the texture and appearance of fine bark. Before termination of the subject, it had ceased all normal feline behavior, remaining motionless for hours before suddenly extending itself in a manner that defied conventional anatomy. The letter writer claimed that scientific study of the wood had continued in secret at a facility in New Mexico until 1917, when an incident resulting in multiple fatalities led to the termination of the program. The incident, described only as a containment failure during the night cycle, reportedly resulted in the deaths of 7 researchers and military personnel. All samples were supposedly destroyed, all research burned, and all personnel reassigned to unrelated projects after signing strict confidentiality agreements. The facility itself, according to the anonymous source, was subsequently buried, literally, beneath tons of concrete and earth. They didn't just close it, the letter stated. They erased it from existence, along with everything we had learned about the material, everything except what remains in the minds of those of us who worked there and in the bodies of those who came into contact with it. Most significantly, the anonymous source suggested that the wood was not of terrestrial origin. He cited analyses indicating its cellular structure was fundamentally different from any known plant species, with properties more closely resembling certain deep-sea organisms that grow in the absence of sunlight. How such material came to be buried deep in the Arizona desert was a question he claimed remained unanswered, though he alluded to impact sites and very old craters that had been identified near each discovery location. The letter referenced geological surveys conducted at the Crowther property that had identified unusual underground formations. At a depth of approximately 200 feet, we discovered what appeared to be a chamber approximately 50 feet in diameter. Attempts to excavate to this depth were abandoned after drilling equipment repeatedly failed in a manner consistent with contact with the material. The decision was made to seal the site rather than risk further exposure. The anonymous writer expressed particular concern about the possibility of additional undiscovered deposits of the material. "We identified only 4 sites," he wrote, "but given the pattern of distribution and certain geological indicators, there could be dozens more scattered throughout the region. The material seems to remain dormant until disturbed." Mr. Crowther's well digging was the catalyst in Arizona. Mining operations exposed the Utah deposit. Road construction unearthed the Nevada sample. Each disruption was followed by a period of subtle growth, then rapid expansion. Of particular concern to the letter writer was the fate of individuals who had been exposed to the material but had not been located or contained by authorities. "We know of at least 3 individuals who displayed advanced transformation but evaded capture," he claimed. "Given the progressive nature of the changes and the compulsion toward isolation that characterizes the later stages, these individuals may have established themselves in remote areas where the transformation could continue undisturbed." The veracity of this anonymous account cannot be confirmed. No official acknowledgement of such a program has ever been made. No corroborating evidence has emerged from government archives. The letter itself might be dismissed as the work of a hoaxer capitalizing on local legends, were it not for one final detail that connects it to the established facts of the Crowther case. The writer described the final stage of human transformation after prolonged exposure to the wood, a stage supposedly witnessed only once in a subject identified as female subject C4, who had been held for observation at the New Mexico facility for approximately 18 months. According to the account, after the subject's skeleton had elongated to the point that she stood nearly 8 feet tall, her skin began to develop a grain-like pattern reminiscent of wood. Her movements became increasingly rigid and constrained. And most disturbing of all, during periods of darkness, she would emit audible creaking sounds, identical to those produced by the wood samples as they stretched. "In the final weeks of observation," the letter stated, "Subject C4 ceased all verbal communication. Her facial features hardened, becoming almost mask-like, with only her eyes retaining any capacity for movement. These eyes, however, displayed an unsettling alertness, tracking the movements of researchers with what I can only describe as hungry anticipation." The subject allegedly escaped confinement in late 1900 during a power failure that disabled the electric lights used to inhibit the stretching process, both in the wood and in affected humans. The anonymous writer described the escape in chilling terms. "The darkness lasted only 7 minutes before emergency generators activated. In that time, she somehow elongated sufficiently to reach the ceiling of her 12-foot cell. When lights were restored, we discovered she had punched through the ceiling material and accessed the ventilation system. By the time the facility was searched, she had vanished. The only evidence of her passage was a trail of splinters and what appeared to be sap, leading to a ventilation outlet on the facility's perimeter." The writer suggested that similar cases might still exist, living in isolation, seeking darkness, and continuing a transformation whose ultimate outcome remained unknown. "We never observed a subject beyond the ambulatory phase," he wrote. "We don't know what comes after. Do they eventually lose mobility entirely, becoming truly tree-like? Or does the transformation lead to something else, something mobile, but no longer recognizably human? The stretching doesn't stop. It simply changes form." The letter concluded with what appeared to be a warning. "If you are ever in the desert and come across an unusually tall, thin tree where no tree should grow, do not approach it, especially not at night. Especially not if it seems to be moving ever so slightly. even without wind. And if you hear creaking in the darkness, do not investigate. Some things are better left underground, undisturbed and undocumented. Whether this anonymous account represents fact, fiction, or some combination of the two may never be determined. What is certain is that by 1920, any official interest in the Crowther case had long since been buried beneath bureaucracy and the passage of time. The property itself remained undeveloped, owned by a succession of corporate entities with obscure ownership structures, until it was eventually absorbed into a military testing range in the 1940s. A fourth source, less direct but perhaps equally significant, emerged in 1931. A geologist named Dr. Harold Winters, while conducting a survey of the Wickenburg area for the U.S. Geological Survey, noted peculiar formations in the vicinity of Bitter Creek. His report described a circular depression approximately 1 mile in diameter, visible only when mapping elevation changes across the region. The depression appears consistent with an ancient impact crater, Dr. Winters wrote, though heavily eroded by subsequent geological processes. Based on the degree of erosion and sedimentary deposition, I estimate the event occurred no less than 10,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. Dr. Winters noted that the center of this depression corresponded roughly with the location of the former Crowther property. He recommended core samples be taken to determine the composition of underlying strata. According to USGS records, this recommendation was reviewed but ultimately denied. A notation in the file, initialed but not signed, stated simply, "Area designated restricted by DOD. No further geological survey authorized." In 1937, a graduate student in anthropology named Margaret Gale conducted research into Native American legends of the Wickenburg area. Among the oral histories she collected from elderly members of the Yavapai tribe was a story about a place called the Growing Ground, described as a location where the earth reaches upward toward the sky. According to the legend, this place had been considered taboo by the tribe since ancient times. One elderly informant told Gale that his grandfather had once ventured into the growing ground despite tribal prohibitions. He returned changed and stretched, and was subsequently banished from the tribe. The informant claimed that stories told of the banished man living alone in the desert, growing ever taller and thinner until he could no longer walk among normal men. The similarity to the Crowther case is suggestive, though far from conclusive. Today, the exact location of the Crowther shack is impossible to determine with precision. Modern maps show the area as restricted federal land. Satellite imagery reveals only desert scrub, indistinguishable from thousands of surrounding acres. Whatever secrets may lie beneath the surface remain undisturbed, officially at least. Local legends persist, however. Residents of modern Wickenburg occasionally speak of unusually tall, thin figures seen at dusk near the old highway. Hikers in the region report finding strange, elongated pieces of wood that seem to grow warm when held. And there are those who claim that on particularly quiet nights, if you stand at the edge of town facing east toward the restricted lands, you can hear a distant creaking, like old wood slowly expanding in the darkness. In 1982, a Phoenix newspaper ran a small story about a ranch hand who claimed to have encountered a bizarre figure while repairing fences on a property east of Wickenburg. The man described seeing what he initially thought was a dead tree standing alone in a wash. As he approached, however, he realized the tree was roughly humanoid in shape, with limb-like protrusions where arms might be. Most disturbing was his claim that, as the sun began to set, the figure began to move, stretching upward in a series of jerky movements accompanied by cracking sounds. The ranch hand's account might be dismissed as folklore or hallucination, were it not for one detail that connects it to the historical record. He claimed that as he fled, he heard a voice behind him, a voice that sounded like wood being split, say just 3 words, "Need bigger house." In 2004, a team from Arizona State University's Department of Environmental Sciences conducted a limited survey of plant life in areas adjacent to the military reservation. They reported finding several specimens of an unidentified woody plant that displayed unusual growth patterns. According to their published findings, these plants exhibited growth rates up to 3 times faster than surrounding vegetation, primarily during nighttime hours. Attempts to cultivate samples in laboratory conditions were unsuccessful, with specimens deteriorating rapidly when removed from their native soil. The researchers noted that the plants seemed to grow in a rough circular pattern around an area they were prohibited from accessing due to military restrictions. One research assistant reportedly resigned from the project after claiming to have seen one of the plants moving in a deliberate manner during a nighttime observation session. This claim was not included in the official report and is known only through personal correspondence that surfaced years later. In 2017, a hiker reported finding a peculiar object while exploring an arroyo approximately 6 miles east of Wickenburg. The object, which he photographed but did not collect, appeared to be a small wooden box sealed with a black, tar-like substance. The location was within the general vicinity of the former Crowther property, though precise correlation is impossible given the limited records available. The hiker posted his photographs online, describing the box as old but well preserved, and noting that it felt unusually warm to the touch despite the cool winter temperatures. When he returned the following day with friends to retrieve the box, it was no longer there. His post was removed from the hiking forum where it had appeared, and attempts to contact him for further information have been unsuccessful. Perhaps most intriguing are the periodic reports from pilots who fly over the restricted area east of Wickenburg. Several have noted what they describe as unusual vegetation patterns visible only from certain altitudes and angles. These patterns reportedly resemble concentric circles with a dark area at the center, visible primarily in early morning or late evening light. Military authorities have consistently attributed these observations to natural geological features enhanced by lighting conditions. The story of the Crowther Shack serves as a reminder of how easily history can be erased when it conflicts with our understanding of the natural world. Official records can be sealed, evidence can be confiscated, witnesses can be silenced or discredited. But traces always remain, in personal journals, in private correspondence, in the memories of those who glimpsed something beyond explanation. In 1898, in the Arizona desert, something was discovered that defied the scientific understanding of the time. Whether it was a previously unknown natural phenomenon, a hoax perpetrated for unknown reasons, or something truly outside our comprehension, the truth remains buried, like so many wooden boxes in the dry earth behind a long-vanished shack. For those who find themselves traveling the highways of Arizona, passing through the seemingly empty desert between Phoenix and Wickenburg, it might be wise to keep your eyes on the road, particularly after sunset. The landscape may appear barren, but beneath the surface, some things continue to stretch and grow, reaching slowly upward through the darkness. And if you happen to notice an unusually tall figure standing motionless among the saguaros, its silhouette too rigid and elongated to be merely human, it would be best not to stop. Some mysteries, once uncovered, cannot be buried again, no matter how deeply we try to enter them in the shifting sands of history and denial. A final note on the Crowther case comes from an unexpected source. In 2020, during renovations of the old Wickenburg General Store building, workers discovered a small wooden box sealed within a wall cavity. The box contained a single sheet of paper, a letter written in a spidery hand, and dated October 1898, 6 months after the investigation of the Crowther property. The letter, apparently written by Marshall Thompson, though never sent, was addressed to the territorial governor. It contained just 3 paragraphs. I write to inform you that despite all efforts at containment, the situation regarding the Crowther material has not been resolved. Last night I observed movement at the edge of town that cannot be attributed to any known animal or human figure. It stood taller than a man on horseback, yet thin as a sapling. It moved in segments, like a measuring worm extending itself. When I approached with my lantern, it retreated toward the restricted area. The sound it made, a creaking, stretching sound, was identical to that produced by the specimens we recovered from the Crowther property. I believe what I witnessed was what remains of Edith Crowther, though I hesitate to suggest she still lives in any conventional sense of the word. I recommend immediate evacuation and quarantine of the entire region. The growth continues, the stretching does not stop, and I fear that what begins in darkness may eventually learn to walk in daylight. No record exists of this letter ever being received by the governor's office. 2 weeks after the date on the letter, Marshall Thompson resigned his position and relocated to California. His subsequent whereabouts and ultimate fate are unknown. For those interested in pursuing this case further, a word of caution. Some questions are best left unanswered. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. And some things once seen cannot be unseen, just as some transformations once begun cannot be reversed. The stretching continues. The growth does not stop. And somewhere in the Arizona desert, something that was once human may still be searching for a house big enough to contain what it has become.